Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, there's a bunch going on right now, but I will try to keep things relatively concise. I mean, you know me. But I'm heading out to Grand Rapids in a couple of hours to visit a member of my trade association. So I've got to cut this off and make sure I'm packed and everything else. It's only my second flight since this whole situation started, but that'll be fine. It's just the COVID exposure concerns more than the flight anxiety stuff. But anyway, they've asked me to speak for a couple of minutes at this event, which is a tour of a couple of their facilities. I got enough notes together to wing it, but when I was putting them together last night, it reminded me of the first time I was ever asked to speak on industry stuff about 20 years ago, which would be about 3 years after I got started covering this stuff. I was heading out to visit a client company in Spokane, Washington. They wanted me to talk to the local, Chamber of Commerce, business people, etc. The invite to speak was a little late, and I didn't have time to put together a real presentation in the office. So the night before, I wrote about 3 pages of hotel stationery notes, and the next day I got 2 lines into the notes. I got a big laugh from the audience and then just winged it for like 20, 25 minutes, which apparently meant I had absorbed a lot more knowledge about the industry I was in than I thought I had, because I didn't know I had anything to say. It turns out I'd internalized a bunch. Anyway, what I'm saying is I will probably do a much better job at this event tomorrow in Michigan. And it'll be good prep for next week when I have a more formal presentation. I have to give at a pharma conference in Philadelphia. For that sort of thing, I've actually spoken at this event in past years. My challenge is actually limiting myself to 25 to 30 minutes, even if I'm winging it, because I can go on and on and on. But I have a bunch of sort of high-level bullet points about the industry, circulated it to all my member companies yesterday and just said, am I missing anything? Are there things I should focus on within that? And they started dumping a lot more stuff on me. So I will have plenty to say, and you know, it won't have anything to do with the podcast. Anyway, last week I mentioned how I'm in this 5-week sprint from Labor Day to mid-October when I'll be hosting my own in-person pharma conference. I've been panicked. There's a lot of project management, a lot of empty cells on the spreadsheet to fill, if you get me. But I'm starting to feel like I'm back on top of things, that all of the moving parts are pretty well tended, and a couple of the key cells are getting filled in. And that if I just pace the next week plus with this trip, plus the Philadelphia conference and another one the day after in New Brunswick and blah, 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 I'll be able to handle the back half of this race and get everything done pretty well and put on a good show for my member companies. It's actually got me thinking, as of yesterday afternoon, of traveling down to Bethesda this weekend for the Small Press Expo, which it's a comics and cartooning thing. And I have serious trepidation, partly from the work, partly from COVID risk, and partly from this would be the first major comics festival I go to, or the first real one, since my friend Tom Spurgeon died in 2019, and he was my guiding light, touchstone, entry point, whatever, to this whole world and to much of my life. So yesterday I started thinking about going. If I get everything done well with the prep for Philadelphia next week and blah, blah, blah. I floated that idea on Twitter, and a bunch of the attendees and people who aren't attending were nudging me to go do it. So we'll see. The upshot is I recorded 2 podcasts last weekend, so I have some breathing room. We're going to get to one of them right now, and I'm not going to bore you with any more of my project management activity, anxieties, or any of that other stuff. So my guest this time is Eva Hagberg, who has a really neat new book out. It came out today, When Eero Met His Match, Eileen Nocheim Saarinen and the Making of an Architect, from Princeton University Press. Eva will talk about the roots and origins of the book in our conversation. It comes out of her PhD thesis, but I'll just tell you, this is a really engaging exploration of the relationship between the famous architect Eero Saarinen, known for the St. Louis Arch, the Yale Whale, and the TWA terminal at JFK, and his second wife, Eileen, who did a lot to make him famous. Eva explores the correspondence between Eileen and Eero, along with the ways that Eero's buildings and projects were covered in the architectural press and mainstream venues in the 1950s and into the 60s. He died unexpectedly in the early 60s, brain tumor. And she really illustrates the role that Eileen played not only in building Eero's reputation, but in changing the way that architecture is covered and is talked about, or changing the discourse, I guess you could say, because the correspondence isn't just Eileen and Eero, it's also how they were relating to clients, to the New York Times, to different architectural magazine editors, what the concept of an exclusive began to mean for them, in terms of having one magazine that had, privileged information or photography of a project that others didn't. It's a really interesting take. And along the way, the book also has chapters about Eva's own history in architecture and as a publicist in that world, and how she began to see Eileen as both a template and as a warning sign, and how the ways architecture is written about and discussed in trade and mainstream media, how those signify changes in the way media relates to its subjects and to its audience. And it goes beyond architecture. But for me, the whole Starchitect thing, it just used to irritate the crap out of me because Frank Gehry buildings just really got on my ass. It's a personal thing. But it's fascinating to see how that very concept developed and the role that these two people played in it, and especially Eileen, and how her work ties into how all of that leads into the celebrity industrial complex of our world today. And there's plenty in the book to ruminate about the role of women in the world, and in business, and focusing on how Eileen sort of played up the ditzy angle when necessary, but was actually a very hard-nosed operator. Plus, if you're familiar with Eva's work, her online presence, or our 2019 podcast, you will not be surprised to know that there's plenty of personal oversharing in the book, too. I mean, by my lights, by hers, we talk about it by the end of the show. It's just the right amount of oversharing. In fact, we're going to kick off this conversation with a recap of her tumultuous life from the 3+ year gap from that previous podcast. I will also note Eva did come on in 2020 twice when I was doing my COVID check-ins, once before and 3 weeks later while she was nailed by COVID and gasping for breath. This time she's also a little out of breath because she is 9 months pregnant and pretty much on the verge of having her first child. So I thank her for making the time, given the publicity she's doing for the book, the personal, physical stuff she's going through, and everything else. But anyway, When Eero Met His Match is an awfully engaging read, and Eva really manages to make this deep exploration of an important subject in under 200 pages with lots of great illustrations and photos. So go pick it up and find out what we're really talking about when we're talking about buildings. Here's Eva's bio from the new book. Eva Hagberg teaches in the Language and Thinking program at Bard College and at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Her books include How to Be Loved, a memoir of life-saving friendship, and Nature Framed, At Home in the Landscape. Her new book is When Arrow Met His Match. And now, the 2022 Virtual Memories conversation with Eva Hagberg. So it's been about 3.5 years.
It's,
More than 3.5.
Yeah.
It was like February.
February 2019, and we're now in
September
2022. So wow.
So no major changes, right? Your life is completely
Just
the same as it was before.
I live in the same place. I'm married to the same person.
Family is no kids or anything. Everything.
I'm remain in the same state of gestation as I was then. No, everything is different.
Did you see all that coming? I mean, I know after the fact you knew some stuff was.
I was trying to think if I knew that I was going to leave my then husband when we spoke. I think I did.
I just didn't want to feel like the cause of it is all I'm saying.
I mean, a butterfly flaps its wings, a gill does an interview, and boom, you're in litigation for 2 years. Let's start with where I am now. And
we'll get to the book. Don't worry.
We will get to the book. So I'm currently 9 months pregnant. Did not see that coming ever. Did not really want kids. I'm still not a baby person. I actually just visited one of my best friends, Jackie, and we showed up. My boyfriend Paul and I, who I had not yet met in 2019 when we spoke. Although I did actually meet him very shortly after. But we walked in, and my friend is holding her 2-month-old baby. And I sort of knew that I should react in some way. I understood that when you see someone's baby, you're supposed to say, "Oh my God, your baby," and can't wait to hold them. And that's what Paul did. So he immediately sort of held the baby, was bonding with the baby. It was great, is soothing her. They're making eye contact. She's grabbing onto his finger. And I'm just sort of looking at the baby. And thankfully, my friend Jackie knows me very well and did not push her baby on me. We sort of sat there. We talked for 2 hours. And finally, after 2 hours, she said, "Eva, do you have any interest in holding my baby?" And I thought, okay, I can lie, or I can tell the truth. And
so just in practice, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess I could just make sure I know how to hold one. But,
So I said, I sort of did the math, and I thought, well, Jackie and I have always told each other the truth about everything. So I said, Jackie, I got to tell you, I have no drive. I have zero drive to hold your baby. And it's not personal. And she said, "Oh my God, of course I know." And then a couple minutes later, I was like, "Oh, I'll give it a shot," And of course, within 4 minutes, I was in love with this baby. We were making eye contact. She was smiling. I was holding her, and I was like, okay, well, she's the one baby in the world that I like. So hopefully I will also like my own baby as much as I now like Jackie's baby.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. You never know. But yeah, so I didn't really want kids. I just thought I'll just keep doing my career. But I met somebody who really wanted kids and did a lot of therapy and a lot of soul searching, and realized that a lot of my resistance was just fear, that I would have some sort of pain, that some sort of, difficulty would ensue if I had a kid. And I just didn't want to add.
You mean physical or
just any variety. Okay. I mean, yeah. So my specific fear was that I would have a boy child who grew up to be, some sort of incel leader. I mean, I had like a very specific nightmare fantasy. Yeah. And I didn't want that. And everything else sort of felt manageable. Like I wasn't scared of pregnancy or childbirth. I just was scared of bringing a life into the world and not having control in some way. I thought
you meant the reputational damage you take.
And my reputational damage. Well, clearly I am not concerned about that, as we will discuss with the book. So I sort of went through this, but I also... I think a lot of what we talked about last time, if I remember correctly, was disavowal and doubling and doing multiple things at the same time. And I think a lot of my book was my first book, How to Be Loved, was about representing intimacy while keeping myself very safe and protected as an artist. And so I want to say, while I was feeling, this fear and this sort of ambivalence, I was doing IVF, which is one of the most intense processes that you can do. And I did it because I have stage 4 endometriosis, and I'm 40 years old, and we did a consult with the doctor, and he was basically like, listen, I think if you guys ever want to have kids, you should, make some embryos. So it sort of goes to show how inaccurate my perception of myself tends to be, because I was saying to people, oh, I'm so ambivalent, I don't even know. And meanwhile, I'm going to this clinic every other day. Yeah. I'm having blood drawn. I'm doing the sort of physically and emotionally excruciating work that goes into 3, back-to-back egg retrievals. And so my actions sort of led me in this direction, and my opinions eventually caught up. And of course, as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I was like, it just sort of felt like the weirdest secret that had ever happened to me. And then I decided to also keep the pregnancy pretty secret. So,
despite living somewhat online.
I live completely online.
Okay, I didn't want to blurt it, but you have a very online
Well, it's like I tell people, I'm like, I did IVF, and they're like, we follow you on Twitter.
Yeah.
I bought a condo. They're like, we follow you on Twitter. So, but I realized when I was doing IVF, I was very public about it, and I posted a lot about it, and it was very difficult for me. And when I got pregnant, I really wanted to tell everybody, and my boyfriend was like, let's just wait until it's until it's safe. And I was like, well, let me tell you something about safety is an illusion. There's no point, and I did learn in pregnancy that there is this idea, which is like, okay, well, once you get pregnant, then you're safe. And okay, once you get a heartbeat at 6 weeks, then you're, and it's not a heartbeat. I want to say to lawmakers in Ohio, it's electrical cardiac activity, not a heartbeat. But people colloquially refer to it as that. So then you think, okay, well, once you see that in ultrasound, then you're safe. Well, no, 12 weeks is really that's when you're safe. But, it's really the 20-week anatomy scan that tells you, everything's good. And well, then you get into sort of so I sort of realized there's no point during which there's ever safety.
Yeah.
So I was sort of telling him, well, I'd rather be, I live my life in public anyway, and I want to be public about this. And then I said, but it was really annoying when I was doing IVF, when I would get sort of unsolicited advice and DMs. And he was like, sort of just watching me. And I was like, yeah, so that was really annoying. No way around that, I guess. And then, and then a couple minutes later, I was like, and I said to him, I've actually been having a great early pregnancy experience. I don't feel any stress. I don't feel any anxiety.
Because your DMs aren't blowing up.
I wonder why. And he was like, okay. Well, and then I was like, oh, I wonder if it's because I'm not getting unsolicited advice. And so I sort of decided to keep it secret. And then it was just sort of fun to have a secret as somebody who's very secretive by nature, but also has a career that is predicated on not having any secrets, and, once again, getting to sort of walk that line. So, so my book launch, hopefully I'm not going to go into labor during it, but if I do, that'll be a fun treat for us all.
Your second baby. My
second baby. Yeah, I guess, right. The book is my second baby, and the human baby will be my third baby. Yeah. Well, my fourth, because my cattle dog is my third baby.
Understood. But not one that you bore intellectually or physically.
Paul, Paul really bore her. Yeah. Whenever I say, are you jealous that I get to be pregnant and you don't? And he reminds me that he carried this 8-week-old cattle dog on his chest in an IKEA bag for, 2 months. So he too gave birth. So, So
tell me about the book. Where did it begin?
Oh,
I mean, I know it's your thesis plus.
Yeah, but, thesis very much Frankenstein into something new. So the book is called When Arrow Met His Match, Aline Luchem Saarinen and the Making of an Architect. The title was very hard to come to. My working title for a long time was What Would Aline Do?, which is relevant. And the book is sort of two books smashed into one, or one book that has 2 parts, maybe is a better way of looking at it. So it tells 2 stories. One story is the love story and the professional story of Eero Saarinen, noted to some mid-century modernist architect, Finnish-American. You may recognize him from such hits as the St. Louis Arch, the JFK, the TWA terminal at JFK, the skating rink at Yale, colloquially known as the Yale Whale because of how it's shaped, and a bunch of other projects. And Aline Saarinen, then Aline Luchem, really talented, skilled, hyper-educated, New York Times associate art critic, was assigned a profile of Arrow, begrudgingly agreed to do it. She flew to Bloomfield Hills, where he had an office, and I sort of recount this in, some say excruciating, I say fascinating detail. They met, they did an interview, and then I think they were driving a car or something happened, and somebody held somebody else's hand, and then things escalated pretty quickly.
It being the 50s. That's how things,
People were wilding in the 50s. I mean, I think we always think like, oh, the 50s, so old. No, people were just getting after it. So they got after it, and she went back to New York and she wrote her story, which she let him edit, which is shocking and scandalous to anybody who's ever written anything for the New York Times. And she really thought that they should get married, and thought that she...
Noting at the time, he was married.
He was also, yes, he was married, yeah.
She was divorced, but yeah.
She was divorced, he was still married, but he was very actively in the market for another wife. So he has these great letters that he wrote to his psychiatrist where he says, here are some people I'm considering marrying. I really want to be dean at Yale. I'd really like to find a wife who can help me be dean at Yale. And he must have...
It's funny because we're watching news radio reruns on Amazon Prime, and one of the ongoing plots is that Stephen Root's character, Jimmy James, has a list of 36 women he wants to marry, trying to figure out which one he should marry for the tax incentives, too. But so, the idea that
very similar.
Was doing this fun. Jimmy James
he was
had
like,
that whole
this textile designer is good, but here's the downside, and this other person is good, here's the downside, so he was really open. He must have intimated something about this to Aline, because she starts writing him letters where she represents herself as an applicant in search of a job, and the job is his wife. But also she says, listen, I think I could help you through talk to sort of work out some of your ideas. And then she says, I have this is all paraphrasing, but she says something like, I know everybody in media. I really know how media works. I think I could handle your public persona. I think I could handle the development of your narrative. And so I trace sort of this very intimate personal love story that then starts to be transformed by this professional relationship. So a couple years go by, or a year goes by, he agrees to divorce Lily Swan Saarinen and to marry Aline Saarinen. She moves to Bloomfield Hills and she becomes his head of information services. And that's when the book sort of shifts from, okay, well, how did they get together, which is like a rollicking story full of juicy details and lots of drama, into how did she start to manage his career? And I trace their correspondence, which of course, declines because they're sitting next to each other, but there's some.
People still text each other in the other room.
Oh, I mean, now, like if I could be a historian of now, yeah, there's a written record, but that moment, right, unfortunately. So I sort of trace the way in which she starts managing, the rollout, the media plan, all of that, the way in which she communicates with magazine editors. And it's a really interesting time for media. So architecture media today, the exclusive is basically like you have to have an exclusive, right? Which means that this magazine is the only magazine that has XYZ image or XYZ project. And that was not always the case. And so I trace how, there's these amazing conversations between herself and Douglas Haskell, an editor of Forum. And he is trying to work out, like, could they start using exclusives? And he says, we want to try this thing where you actually just send us the material. And you sort of see, I really trace, like, how good of a manipulator she was. And she would say things like, oh, that's such a great idea. Of course, we love Forum. Arrow loves Forum. Unfortunately, materials are chaotic.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'm just a dumb girl, so
I'm
I can't
just a dumb
get all
girl.
this for you.
I don't know where. And so I sort of write about the way in which she performs professionalism. And then when she gets into a pickle, she's like, I'm just an eager beaver woman. Yeah. I'm just chewing on my pencils. Like, I don't know what's going on, and I sort of show that was a performance and that was a type of performance. And I contextualize it a little bit historically, and I just sort of trace that development, and then I use, I analyze, how Saarinen's work was written about before Aline and how it was written about after. And my sort of main contention is that her interventions, both really practical in terms of managing what project went where, were really instrumental, but also the way in which she told him to talk about projects was really, sort of new and made it more legible. And the TWA terminal is like a surprising building. It was a surprising form. And she really encouraged him to use analogies and metaphors, which I think made it sort of legible in a way. So that's like one big strand of the book is, okay, this historical study, which both I think gives her credit where credit was never given, and also introduces this sort of professional role, which is the architectural publicist. And then the other part of the book, and it alternates chapters, is about my own career, first as a design writer and then as a secret publicist. So the original working title, What Would Aline Do?, was based on my working as a publicist, my methods completely borrowed from Aline's, because it turns out that what worked in 1950 in terms of getting people to like you is sort of similar to what works in 2017. Exactly. This is the great thing about being a historian. People are the same, right? Yeah. People are just interested in finding a good boyfriend, turning that boyfriend into your husband, making money, getting a little bit famous. It's just the same. And so I sort of, I didn't stumble into, but I just sort of followed, the next available open door and found myself running a, 10 client, 3-person PR firm. And I write about the sort of challenges and opportunities of that. And again, try to sort of contextualize that into a broader understanding of like, how do we think about architecture? How do we talk about it? Is architecture interesting? This is my question of myself all the time. So, with the like self-revealing things, I mean, when I was writing the book, I was sure I would never work in PR again. And I just needed a break. So a lot of the chapters are like, I will never do. Here's what I learned.
Lighting fire to this bridge over here.
Totally setting the bridge on fire. And then I sort of crawled my way back. So I was telling Paul this morning, I was like, yeah, I think I either will get more PR clients or no PR clients after the book comes out.
Yeah, she's so dismissive. We have to work with her.
Yeah, exactly. That's my secret. Yeah.
Play hard to get.
Exactly.
Are there degrees, and we'll go in depth with the book itself, but ways in which, obviously you saw your career in parallels with Aline, but, are there also correctives or things you saw that that's a direction not to go, or this is either just times have changed and you don't have to be like this, or other aspects that you were, what should Aline have done?
Right. So when Paul and I first got together, he's an industrial designer, and we started having this conversation, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? And turned out we had a lot of mutual friends, and we were both in the design world. And he sort of would float things like, I've always wondered what it would be like to have somebody on hand who can kind of do, PR and kind of handle, being the public face and all this stuff. And I would sort of say, it's so interesting having the job that I have where I work with designers as sort of their public face. And, and once again, it's like we're sort of making the connections. And we ended up taking this long drive around a car park in Colorado. And we said, okay, let's work together. That sounds really fun. But how do we not, get into a pickle? And he asked what happened with Arrow and Aline. Because at the end of Arrow's life, which he did not know was the end of his life, they start writing to each other again because they're not communicating as much. And the office memos show like they're pretty annoyed at each other. Yeah. And there's one great example where she gets a letter. She sends it to him. He says, isn't this your department? She writes back, I don't have a crystal ball. And you sort of see these layers of pages, just that kind of like smaller and smaller notes with more and more curt responses. And she was asked to write a book about him by some publishing house. And she wrote back and she said, I really would like, and the phrase was, I'd like to confine my interests to those outside the office, which is sort of an interesting use when you say confine versus expand. But I think that speaks to the strength of her kind of conviction that she really was done being just Arrow's translator. And so I think where she went wrong and where she knew she went wrong and was really trying to correct when he died and she ended up having to write the book was that she just kind of went all in on being his representative, his translator. and lost sight of a lot of what she loved to do, which was write about architecture, write about art. I mean, she was so smart. She was so connected. She was such a good writer. She was so good at articulating really, really complicated ideas. And I think after, the initial first couple of years, it was just really exciting to talk about this man that she was in love with and his work. I think she really suffered. So when I talked to Paul, I was like, I think we need to have two things really clear. One is that our relationship takes priority, right? So if we get into a situation where we're making gazillions of dollars, and we're doing such a good job running this industrial design firm, but we aren't getting along, like we choose our relationships. That was like a really important thing to say. And the second one was that I could kind of tap out at any point, and that I would always have time for my own work and my own books and my own interests. And so far it's worked out really well. I sell some chandeliers and I write books, And then the other really big thing that I learned that I talk much more explicitly about in the book is the difference between being married to your client and not being married to your client. And one of the things that I have struggled with throughout my life is, appropriate boundaries.
You?
That's rude. Excuse you. And one of the things that I sort of realized when I really burned out on PR and was like, I can't do this anymore, was, I was never inappropriate. I didn't try to hold anybody's hand or take them into the coat closet the way that Aline took Arrow into the coat closet. But I think I got,
There's still closeness.
There's closeness.
Yeah.
There's an intimacy and a closeness. And I think there's something very intoxicating about intellectual compatibility. There can be something that feels very intense. And I certainly go towards that. I'm a moth to a flame of like intensity and discourse and conversation. And so when I would be in these conversations with these architects, like I would not hang up the phone. I never said like, okay, we have, half an hour of a phone. I would just be like, great, call me anytime. And then we'd be talking about like, types of wood or whatever, their childhoods. And, and I think I wanted myself to be indispensable so that my career was safe. But I think in retrospect, I used, instead of just relying on the good quality of my work, I tried to make myself kind of everything to a lot of my clients. So I don't think that Aline could have not married Arrow, but I think I now with my clients have a very, very different attitude.
Yeah.
So
how's the field changed from when you were starting out in that PR versus what it is now? And maybe pre-pandemic and what we're in now is also a dividing line. But
the architecture field or the media field or both? What is the
matrix.
field?
Yeah.
So, the media field has changed since I was a writer. So I started writing about architecture in 2003, moved to New York. And the field then it felt very wide open. There were a number of magazines. They had budgets. I wrote for Wallpaper magazine and they would just send me all over it was incredible. They were like, oh, we want you to write about John Portman's house in Georgia. So here's your flight to Georgia. And we want you to write about somebody else's house in Seattle. So here's your flight to Seattle. And it was amazing. And there was also a very well-funded PR ecosystem. So if the magazines weren't sending, then the, developer was sending us. So it felt very glamorous and luxurious. And of course I was broke. This was like a weird thing, was being so broke and then having access to such luxury.
Yeah.
I remember being taken on this like 10-day trip through Switzerland and just being given like 50 franc vouchers to go to dinner at whatever restaurant and then going home and just like bouncing my rent checks and buying granola bars. I got flown to Bali to do a story and I had like $27 in my checking account. And I remember I got dropped off at the airport and they had like a $15 airport exit fee. And I didn't have enough money on my credit cards or my bank account, or they had like a $30 exit fee. And I didn't have enough money. And I remember just being like, I am screwed. And I had just spent 10 nights in this villa, getting room service, having fruit plates delivered, swimming in the pool, all to write one story for wallpaper. Yeah, the story was good. I worked hard on it. But just that moment, and then this moment of panic in the Bali airport, and just thinking, and I think I finally, like, I had a couple, I don't remember the Balinese currency, but I had like a couple US dollars. I had some Balinese money, and I had a credit card, and I somehow cobbled together. But then I landed in New York, and I don't know how I got, I mean, I just had no money for the next like 3 weeks. So that was sort of, you know, that was the field then, or that was my experience of the field. And now, I mean, I think press trips they're probably still happening. I'm not getting invited on them.
But after the book, you'll see.
Well, we'll see. Yeah. If I burned all the bridges or built them, we don't know. The book will either build or burn bridges. But so there were many magazines, and they seemed to have a lot of funding, I think is the point. In the 1950s, there were many fewer magazines, but they very much, like, everybody read them, and it was very important to be in them. So it was like Forum, Progressive Architecture, Record, and the New York Times. And it was like, great, that's what you got. I'm sure I'm forgetting one. So early 2000s, there were more, but there was still sort of this sense of like, there were maybe 7 or 10 that you like really wanted to be in as a writer, as a subject. Now, print magazines, I don't know, it's sort of like how everybody, every year, you know, people say painting is dead, and then they do a huge show about painting. I feel it's like print is dead, but actually print is alive, right? Like more people are buying print books than ever before, except for when even more people bought them, but it's... So I think in some ways print media is very, very much alive. And I think people really value print media. And you look at hires like Assad Serkat at El Decor. I think he's doing amazing stuff with that magazine. You know, Digest, I think, has become a little bit extremely celebrity focused, which...
It's the Times.
Which
is part of what we'll talk about.
Exactly. Yeah. But there is much more understanding now of, I think, a couple of things. One of them is like economic realities and people needing to work for a living, which I think was not, like, I remember when I started writing, I would meet other freelancers and they seemed to worry a lot less and get stuck in a lot fewer pickles than I did. You know, I was always like, okay, why am I in a Balinese airport and I can't afford to get out, you know? And then finally somebody sort of intimated to me that a lot of these people didn't actually need to work for a living, which may or may not be true, but...
From my own trade magazine experience, I used to write for a household and personal products magazine when I was in my 20s. And occasionally we would intersect, and this is business to business world, but we would intersect with the consumer magazines like Elle, Mademoiselle, et cetera. And they were... girls with trust funds generally and didn't need to work. And I was the weird guy who showed up at some of these things. Although it all came to, and I'll tell you the story off mic about the time I met Princess Elizabeth of Yugoslavia and swept her off her feet, which filled all these 20-something trust fund girls with absolute dread and horror because they just thought they were coming to sniff a couple of swatches of perfume and didn't realize we were going to get into a conversation about linguistics and the Cyrillic alphabet. And, things went really, really,
That's a classic Gil experience.
It'll become a story someday. I'll write it. But yeah, it's that degree of who can afford to work in the city has always been a factor, and it's just been multiplied or magnified as the inequities have grown greater. Yeah, and so I mean, I think it's the same with designers. It's the same with architects. There is sort of this ecosystem where, like, you know, some people have to work for a living and some people don't. And I think that was very secret in the early 2000s in terms of like how the field has changed. Now, everybody's unionizing. Everybody's being really open. Salary transparency is a thing. People talk about needing to work for a living. People talk about needing to make money. People talk about their debt. As you wrote about a few years ago. Exactly. You know, when I bought my condo, I remember... I was like, I bought a condo, and then I was like, my parents gave me a lot of money. Like, that's how you know, and that felt important to me. Whereas in the early 2000s, I think I would have just like died of shame and horror, you know, that anybody knew that my parents helped me. And now it's sort of like, well, here's my cards. This is how I can do this. Exactly. In case you're like, how does this person who writes an essay a year, like, how is she buying a condo? What? Again, also my PR career was lucrative, but secret. So that's, you know,
No longer a secret.
You just tell people you were dealing or something like that.
I know. That would have been great. Like selling Samsung my plasma. Although, having read my other book, nobody wants my plasma.
Yeah, I just realized I can't donate blood. I'm like, oh. Yeah, that's not going to work anymore.
No.
Oh, well. Yeah.
I know.
We're a couple of messes.
Speak for yourself, man. I'm doing great. So as my lungs are like pushed into my if I'm out of breath, it's because my lungs are in my throat because of this baby. But the field in general, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that has changed between the early 2000s and now, and maybe that makes now closer to the 1950s, is a resurgence of interest in the built environment and a resurgence of interest in architecture. And I remember when I first started writing about architecture, my friends were like, that is like, what? Like, what? Okay, like, that's great. And now many more of my friends who have different careers read my articles, which are occasionally about architecture. There seems to be much more interest in the relationship between the built environment and social justice, environmental justice, political, issues, economic issues. I mean, I think there is just more of an appetite now for ideas and engaging with ideas instead of thinking like, well, architecture is really complicated and it doesn't really apply to me. I think people are realizing, oh, it actually applies to them. It applies to their neighbors. It applies to, people. I mean, just reading the news this morning about what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi. And it's like, okay, like the built environment and infrastructure are central to the foundations of life. They are not solely, look at this very nice house that nobody can afford, or look at this museum that you'll probably never go to. But, I think there's also definitely widening inequality. I mean, I follow a lot of interior designers on Instagram to try to sell them very expensive chandeliers. And just the amount of like concentrated wealth, I think is, I'm not the first to say this. I mean, it's astonishing. And that seems to have changed the field where it's like high-end luxury residential design is really booming. And then you kind of have a handful of firms that are looking at, urgent issues of homelessness in LA or thinking about, affordable housing. But there's not really, a friend of mine on Twitter, Dan Seljak, has this whole obsession with the missing middle. So it's like a bit that he does, but there is kind of the middle has been decimated not only socially, politically, economically, and culturally, but also I think architecturally. So I think the field is kind of grappling with that. And, I mean, I represent architects who do really high-end residential single-family houses. And I think we all, we just understand that we need to live and we do it. And it's an interesting way to engage with ideas. But I think there's just more consciousness about that now. So
when it comes to that changing of the discourse and that sort of reflection back to the 1950s, how responsible do you think Aileen was in those terms, in terms of changing the way we, not just what architecture was, but the way we talk about it? I
mean, as her biographer and her fan.
We'll also talk about when you first came across the correspondence, because I still want to,
I think that she was sort of like a proof of concept in a way. I mean, I think she showed that, you could take an architect who would describe his work in very abstract terms. Arrow would talk about the TWA terminal in terms of this like exploration into humanism and grand ideals of quote, man, end quote. And she was able to say, I think you should say it looks like a bird in flight. And he was like, oh, I hate that bird idea. And she's like, oh, just, go with me. And the bird idea really worked. So I think that she was sort of instrumental in showing that there are ways to talk about architecture that did not originate with the architect, which I think is a very important intervention that writers do, and sort of a misunderstanding of what publicists do. They don't just type what the architect says. The architect mostly says things that are nonsensical. Most architects that I know,
when you actually see them interviewed as opposed to reading them in print,
right? And so because when you read them in print, they've been either given bullet points by somebody like me or their answers have been written by somebody like me. Yeah, so in print, they're linear, they're narrow, they make sense. And then, you see them and you're just like, what is going on? So I think that Aileen's interventions kind of showed that you could I'm really interested in this idea of like the legibility of a building. Does a building tell a story? I don't think a building inherently tells any kind of story. But I think she sort of showed that you can say things that might seem simple, but actually really help frame the way that somebody experiences a building. So,
do you feel that's for the benefit of the layman, or was it also benefiting, quote unquote, architectural critics and the rest of the architecture world?
I mean, that's a great question, right? Because I think that makes us wonder, like, what makes an architecture critic? I mean, what sort of qualifies somebody to be one? And I mean, I think it definitely benefits the reader. Right.
I mean, it seems like the first order is for the layman to understand.
The layman
that's a
reader.
bird.
Right, exactly.
They get it, but...
Exactly. And, I write about this Time magazine cover story where there's a little anecdote in the story about how they're eating grapefruit at breakfast, and Arrow looks at the grapefruit and then he's like, this is going to inspire the shape of a building, which is not how Arrow worked. Arrow was not like looking at grapefruits. But Aline knew that would be a really great story, much better than like, well, I went to the office and I tried a couple different versions and then I agonized and then I built a model and then whatever. In terms of the critic, so there's a very popular online architecture magazine, and sometimes people say that all they do is repurpose press releases.
Take the adjectives out.
Yeah.
That was the business to business, the editorial test we always gave. Was, here's a press release, do a rewrite of this, which was basically take out the adjectives, and they're no longer the leading manufacturer of X. They're a manufacturer of X.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, I think there's, and they have many different writers, and some of the writers I work with and really respect, and they certainly do much more than repurpose the press releases, even if they quote from them. But, I think there is... I think the critics now occupy this sort of really interesting space where there aren't really any there are some full-time architecture critics still on staff, like Mark Lamster at the Dallas Morning News, Blair Kamen, who was at the Chicago Tribune for forever until I think he took a buyout. I mean, Michael Kimmelman is like nominally an architecture critic for the New York Times. I think he mostly... Right. So, he's like off in his own, some kind of planet.
I made a gesture.
Yeah, and the gesture was accurate. So I think we don't really have full-time architecture critics. And then you would think, okay, well, what is the role? I think people like Kamen really saw themselves as, protectors of a city, right? I mean, sort of the Ada Louise Huxtable model, where she would see a design and she would be like, well, this design kind of does a bunch of really bad stuff. And then theoretically, the design would change. I don't think that exists anymore. I don't think there's critics that are like wielding true power. So you sort of have people who write about architecture now more than you have critics. And again, I think you have people that maybe are more interested in design and interior design, and then they sometimes write about architecture. And then you have people that are like very academic and they write about architecture, and they certainly would bristle at the idea that anything that they write is influenced by a publicist, though I would contend that it is. Of
course.
Yeah. So I think it does, and sort of like very roundabout answer your question. I think in every case, that intervention, the sort of narrative intervention, the language intervention does play in, and it just, there's everything from rewriting the press release but taking out the adjectives to convincing yourself as an academic that you're simply looking at the available archive. And the sort of academic intervention that my book does is to point out that a lot of architectural historians use the media as a neutral archive. They're like, oh, well, this person, by which I mean, this person appeared in the press a lot. I looked it up in the Avery Index, and they're in the New York Times 113 times, so therefore they're famous, and they're famous because they earned it. And I'm saying,
they had a good publicist.
If it was post 1953, it's because they had a good publicist. And so we really need to, as historians, acknowledge this role. I think as thinkers, acknowledge the fact that, my contention, my argument, right? That we come to buildings with some sort of narrative intervention, right? We don't actually have these unmediated encounters with the building. They're always mediated through some form of narrative. And as lay people, we actually have a sort of an easier entry point into understanding architecture courtesy publicists / the media, because everything that you read in a magazine has had some sort of publicist's hand on it at some point.
Yeah.
98%. You know.
And the Aileen era really begins shortly after photography becomes the deal. So you're also incorporating visual in a way that didn't happen before. You'd have architectural renderings and drawings, but now you're actually either seeing them in process or seeing these buildings in a sort of photographic realism.
Yeah, and like black and white to color. And that was like a big thing too, which I should have read more books about that. I remember when I was working on the dissertation version of this, which, to be clear, this is like a completely, this book takes some of the research from the dissertation, but it is not a dissertation. If you don't want to buy a dissertation, don't worry, you're not. But in a dissertation,
but you get all the goofy stories about her time as a publicist.
Yeah.
Too. It's great. So.
Exactly. Thank you. Exactly.
And she says it's professional, but it's also, there's three parts. It's professional, the personal, and the Aileen and Arrow side too. So,
yeah, exactly. Thank you. But I did try to do a little bit of okay, what was going on with photography? And I remember I sort of opened the door to that archive, of just people writing about photography as a medium. And I was like, this can either be my life's work or exactly. I was we're just gonna, so I remember my advisor, Margaret Lovell, absolute icon, complete legend, in her very meticulous pencil would write in Life magazine, looking for this. So I think there's sort of one or two paragraphs that made it in that are also photography.
Yes. But again, the book would have ended up becoming at least twice the size if you really got into what that all meant.
17 times. Yeah, exactly.
But tell me about when you first encountered the correspondence.
Oh.
What was the moment for you? A, the moment of discovering it. B, the moment of, holy crap, this is my thesis.
Yeah. So I think it was 2011, maybe 2012. And I was working on my master's thesis in architectural history at UC Berkeley in the PhD room. And I had just started dating somebody who I was super into, because I'm just incredibly into everybody that I date for the first 2 to 3 months. Usually I'm like, oh my God, I have found my one true love. And then 2 years later, I'm like, why? That was a nightmare, which I don't think I'm repeating now, for many reasons, but
don't listen, Paul. It's okay.
It does not apply to you. So I said that's important context, right? So I'm sort of in this relationship, and I'm working on my master's thesis about, Angelo Donchia and Architectural Digest. And I was sort of interested in, it was, in, I think, 1972, Digest published this designer, Angelo Donchia's own apartment. And I somehow wrote 100 pages about this. And was really interested in sort of intimacy, publishing somebody's own project, what that looked like. So I was sort of kind of interested in media and architecture. So I have this personal situation. I have this moderate level of intellectual interest, but I was really pumped to get into the PhD program and write my PhD about sci-fi movies. So that was my
starting with Blade Runner, I assume, or where were you going with this?
Blade Runner was somewhere in there. Okay. But yeah, I mean, Code 46, this amazing movie, Blade Runner, Children of Men. I had this whole proposal. Yeah. About sort of dystopian day after tomorrow, architecture, whatever.
And then we got there. But anyway, go.
And now we live in hell. And, I was just wasting time or whatever. And I think it was, I should have looked this up, because every interview I'm I think it was this, but it might have not been. But I think it was.
Tell a different one each time. It'll be so much funnier if you have a different myth of the origin of this every single time.
I'll be it was Architectural Record Online. It was definitely not. I think it was Curb, and I think it was Alex Lang, and I think it was February, because it was this Valentine's Day, look at this amazing collection of cards that Eero Saarinen sent to his wife. And I looked at them, and they were so great. They were these sketches, and they were drawings, and I was oh, these are so cool. These are even cooler than watching Children of Men 19 times. And maybe I can use these as inspiration for my kind of, in retrospect, sort of creepy habit of writing cards to my then new love interest. And I was sort of okay, this is great. And then, I noticed that it was in the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian. And so I was like, oh, let me see if I can find those, because I was sort of excited to be a historian. And I found the archive, and I started looking into it and realized that, the Smithsonian Archives of American Art had digitized every single letter that Arrow had sent Aline and that Aline had sent Arrow, and the correspondence was voluminous. And I started reading, and I just was like, oh, God, I had a pre-existing interest in other people's private business. Like that, I should clarify that.
I didn't make any snide comment this time.
I know, and I just watched your face just being like totally neutral.
The beard helps me cover up the...
And I don't have my glasses on, so I can't really see.
If I had the mask on, it'd be even better.
Totally, exactly. So I've always been really interested in other people's business and how people get along and how people decide to date, how they decide to get married. And here was this archive of people talking about exactly that. And Aline very helpfully had typed everything, so it was really easy to read. And then there were these cards, and I found this birthday card, Case Study of a Romance, and she'd sort of written these like very sweet phrases and cut them out. And, I just was like utterly entranced, and I was like, oh my God, like I love Aline. She seems so great. And then I think I sort of forgot about it for a while. Then I'm like, things get really hazy.
Which alludes to the previous podcast we've done and all the stuff that
right.
Eva went through.
Events occurred, although actually the events occurred, right? So I think it's a little hazy because I was also like being harassed by somebody in my department. And so but I didn't realize that I was being harassed. I just was like, oh, I'm stupid. Like I'm just a bad scholar. And so I went through this whole soul searching, and I was like, okay, I'm going to leave grad school because I just am like not like, I don't know, it's like really hard and I'm stupid. And I talked to Professor Lovell, and I said, thank you for everything, because I had taken a class with her kind of every semester since my very first semester. And I said, but, I just like the architecture department is just like bananas. And I just like, I'm just going to leave grad school. And she said, well, it's very sad because I think you're actually really good. And she told me that you could do an interdisciplinary program at UC Berkeley, which like a very small number of people did, but you could sort of assemble your own committee and make a petition. But you needed an interdisciplinary project to do this. And so by this point, my sort of sci-fi movie project had kind of drifted into the ether. And I started thinking about this correspondence and wondering if I could combine my very deep interests in autobiography and life writing, my interests in how people get along, my interest in architecture, my interest in sort of making a historical argument. And I sort of formulated this proposal for a project that could not be done in any home department, so I couldn't just switch departments, but it really, it used letters as documents, which is very true. I use them as sort of visual documents and do this analysis that looked at architectural history, but through the lens of media, that looked at, epistolary relationships through the lens of autobiography. I sort of like shoved everything together. I did this proposal, I did a whole symposium. It was like very exciting, jumped through a lot of hoops. And that was approved. And then in early 2013, I was like, great, I am ready to rock. Let me get back into this archive. We're going to party. We're going to have a great time. And that is when events occurred. So.
Yeah. And that led us to 2019.
Exactly.
The big 6-year gap that at least got a book out of the process and a second book.
Yeah. If you want to know what happened, you can buy the book.
Yeah.
No, but so my, I got very sick, and so my progress was interrupted for a while, but
you had your origin story, at least.
Yeah. And then I started seriously working on it in 2015, summer of 2015. I was like, all right, I'm going to read every single letter. I'm going to just go through the correspondence. And, my argument just sort of clarified itself. And that was the great luxury of doing, early versions of this research in grad school, was that I had access to people who read like 15, first drafts of my first chapter. And I got to really figure out, like, what am I arguing? Why does it matter? In academia, everybody just says, like, what are the stakes? Like, what the stakes are is the most important question. I was able to sort of finally figure out what the stakes were. And now here we are. Now it's a book, which is amazing.
And, well, last we talked before this was complete, there was also the, working on fiction and figuring you got memoir, history, and...
Well, I did write a novel.
Yeah.
In between when we last talked and now, but my agent didn't really see a path. So if anybody wants a novel about an imaginary pandemic...
Yeah, I was going to say dystopian pandemic fiction is really going to go over well.
TikTok, podcast influencers, and teens, hit me up.
So is architecture a project of immortality or not?
Ooh, good question.
You asked the question.
Oh.
No, I mean, it's something you bring up when you didn't realize that you were never asking these guys.
Right.
Why?
Right. Yeah, I know. I think yes, and I think every project is a project of immortality. I mean, I think that what I learned from my last book and the experiences that led to it are that and when I say we, I mean
we.
upper, intellectual American upper middle class. Actually, WASPs are great at talking about death. This is one thing my family is very comfortable with estate planning and talking about our deaths. But I think that much of what many people do is predicated on an absolute resistance to dying. To anything that they do dying and wanting to sort of preserve a legacy. I mean, I think the idea of a legacy is fascinating and troubling. I think where architects have kind of an edge is that they do actually build physical markers that theoretically could last in some places for, my closest conception to eternity, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, no idea. And I think that is part of what makes architects so often emotionally dysregulated is that there is this kind of weird shared mythology around buildings. And it's also, the thing that has stuck with me since my first day in architecture school as a 17-year-old undergrad in 1999, everybody knows how old I am, was I had this sort of fear on behalf of architects that they would make the wrong move or put the brick in the wrong place or put the window in the wrong place or put the roof in. And I kept thinking, you can't fix it once it's done, And I think the flip side of that, if you take that fear and you turn it into confidence or ego is I'm going to put this here and it's never going to be moved, unless it gets destroyed through forces, natural or unnatural. So I guess that's why I said yes and, because I think everybody has, not every, yeah.
No, that was my mortality last summer. That was the moment of, well, this show is going to be the thing that lasts. I don't have kids. I'm maybe in another couple of weeks. But there's that sense that there's something that you left behind or some cultural mark.
And you were driven to leave something behind, or did you only?
No, I realized in that moment, it was in the interim before I got the best bad news, it was if I got 6 months left, let's just make sure this is, preserved. And, there are things I did here that will be, people can listen to and understand who somebody was. Not me, of course, because I'm lying through all of these things and just putting up fake personae. Yeah. But, for
and did you find that comforting?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, my big moment was the sense of if I was going to get the worst bad news, I was fine. Mm-hmm. I felt okay, I've
because you had something. I've
done something. Yeah. I've had a good marriage. I've done the family side thing, but it was didn't write the big novel, et cetera. But I managed to put together something that's significant.
Yeah.
And then I got the best bad news, and it turned into, God damn, I got to keep putting out more episodes, motherfucker.
Why did I find meaning in this?
Oh,
Yeah.
But even doing the 500th recently and having that moment of not just the tributes from the living guests, but going back and getting excerpts from the few guests who have died over the years.
Yeah.
Seeing what I captured, the little bit that I could share with the world, it means something.
Yeah.
But it's also, everything's illusory. We know everything's,
Well, this is my constant refrain, is safety is an illusion, And yet I long for safety in all things. And,
we all do. But you get that Alan Watts thing where it's like, yeah, you can do that, but you're not living at that point. You're just trying to build guardrails.
Exactly. Yeah.
Buildings don't exist as structures, but as multivalent ideas. Oof. We're still good with that too, right?
We're still good with that. Right? Yep. I stand by that. Whatever version of me wrote that, I agree with her.
Yeah. Are there stages of the book that you recognize as, that was the Eva of 2017, or that was,
I mean, I think so I have to say, reading the researched parts, I was very proud of Eva of 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Because I remember when I got my PhD and I moved to New York. I had moved to New York and then I went back and I got hooded, which is when you officially become a doctor. And I came back to New York and it was the middle of winter and I was walking around and I thought to myself, if I die, all this knowledge dies with me. Like, I'm the only person who knows as much as I do about Aline Saarinen, which, in academia, you're like, yes, I am the world expert on, and then you define this incredibly narrow scope. So I was like, I'm the world expert on Aline Luchem Saarinen's professional contributions to Eero Saarinen's career and the media between 1951 and 1962. People have asked me about her work after he dies, and I'm like, I have literally no idea.
Yeah, you got a couple of mentions of she did some TV and wrote a book.
Whatever. She did some stuff. It just wasn't in my, but I remember walking around and feeling sort of this like incredible moment of pride, and then feeling very concerned because there's always this. For me, there's always like, did I really read every letter? Or did I I think especially when a book comes out, I do have this moment of like, did anybody check this book?
Was somebody else looking at this?
And like the thing about doing a peer-reviewed scholarly publication with a press like Princeton, many people checked this book. Yeah. Like many people read many versions of it and were like, I think you got to take another look at, so it's been very thoroughly. So I think there's like the Eva who sort of triumphed over, various issues in grad school, which are easily findable. And so I sort of look at that Eva and I'm like, oh, damn, way to like pull through. I had like a brain hemorrhage and then I passed my qualifying exams. Like, that's pretty rad. And then, but the personal parts, I mean, this is like the cost of using my own life as a medium. And I talk to people and they say sometimes like, well, you're very brave to do what you do. And I tell them, I'm like, it is not, I'm very cowardly. I just am unable to imagine consequences. I just like, I was diagnosed.
More compulsive.
I was diagnosed with ADHD recently. I think it explains a lot. I just like, I don't anticipate, any sort of future outcome for anything, right? So I'm like today, I had not registered you as a guest. I was utterly unprepared for that, but I just knew it would be fine. And usually things are fine. And when they're not fine, then eventually later they're fine. So this is sort of a way of getting to like every time I write something personal, I do it from a place of detachment and fealty to this idea of what the art will communicate or do. And we talked about this with my last book, which was very revealing in many ways. But when I was writing it, I was just like, I need this scene to work. I need it to link with this other scene. I need this character to make sense. I'm very dispassionate and I just write. And I sort of use myself and my experiences from a great distance as though they are an archive. I mean, I had the exact same emotional relationship. I was probably more emotionally connected to Aline's archive than I was to my own memories. But I sort of lay them out on, an imaginary table. And I think, well, what is going to serve the argument, right? What is going to advance the idea? What is going to get the reader engaged? And I just use it. And I don't imagine that I'm a real person. I don't imagine that anybody else is a real person. I just sort of go for it. And then I have one or two people read it. And then I try, I always try to read it again and think, have I offended anybody? I certainly never want to offend anybody or harm anybody. But I read some of the personal things now and I'm like,
I could see how that would be misconstrued.
Well, no, it's just sort of like, why did I I sort of write about like having this nervous breakdown in Thanksgiving 2019, which in retrospect mostly was predicated by my divorce, which, you know, we sort of started the conversation by saying, right, things have changed. So I was married. I decided the day my book came out to leave my marriage. And I just thought it would be really easy. I mean, I just was like, how hard could it be? You know, I'll sign some paperwork. And
you had assets.
I had assets, and I was the sole earner, and I got married in a community property state. And suddenly I was staring down a bunch of years of alimony that I had to pay and division of assets. And I did not want to pay that alimony. And, you know, I've come to see that, like, I signed a marriage contract. I didn't know what the contract entailed, and I discovered the terms of the contract, and I tried to revise the contract, and you can't do that so, you know, I think I caused myself and other people a lot of, in retrospect, unnecessary pain, but I was really in this situation where, I just felt like I was being drained by everything. And, you know, my clients, I had too many clients in retrospect, and I had promised too much. But I am a Leo overachiever. And so instead of, you know, letting one of them go or referring them out, I just like tried to dig more and more into myself. And at the same time, I was getting letters from a lawyer saying that I was like, you know, a terrible person and not paying enough money and sending money every month to somebody who I thought had caused me great emotional harm. And so that was really painful. And then I asked my lawyer if I could, you know, work less and maybe let go of one of my clients. And I was advised that would not look good with the courts, that people dissipate their assets. Exactly. Yeah. So I sort of felt like, okay, well, I can't stop working, but I'm totally overwhelmed and I have too much to do. And I wrote those sections in fall 2020 when, like, it was all still pretty fresh, you know. And I remember my editor on my first book saying that one of the sort of downsides of writing about something really close to when it's happened is, like, it might not be the most processed version. And so I certainly, you know, I stand behind the book. I stand behind everything that I wrote. I don't think I would change it, but I'm sort of realizing on the, you know, the eve of its publication that I do reveal a lot about myself. That I once again was missing the chip that I think many people have, which is like, maybe keep that to yourself. Like, I just have no keep it to yourself chip. And I think that makes for really good work often because I'm not scared. And you can tell when writers are scared. I think, you know, they're like, oh, that was, you know, a really hard time. And I'm always like, why can't I do that? Why can't I be like, oh, it was a challenging time? It's like, because nobody wants to read that, you know, and I write things that people want to read. But, you know, I think, so I look at that version, I guess, and I'm like, man, 2019 Eva was hurting. I think like that's like, I see when I read that section that I was like really overwhelmed. And I was like,
does it help having that frozen in time like that?
Help how?
Help you be able to see what you were.
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, I'm full of those, but
no, you're perfect.
No, but yeah, that sense of good, because otherwise it's lost.
No, it's
processed
not lost.
and gone.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting assumption.
Not necessarily the fact that it's published, but the fact that it's.
Yeah. So I also wrote a divorce memoir while I was finishing this and writing my TikTok novel. No, I wrote the TikTok novel and then that didn't sell. And I was like, I'm just a memoirist. So I wrote a divorce memoir, which I had to write like 37 drafts of because the first 36 drafts were like, my ex is really annoying.
That's the Philip Lopate School of Personal Essays is the number one thing not to do is settle scores.
Exactly.
Yeah, nobody wants to read that.
And so finally, I mean, the book now, it's me settling a score with myself. Like, I was like, oh, I am the virus. Okay, now we can write a book, right? Now we got it. But the point is, I mean, that's such an interesting question. Like, I'm like sort of like flummoxed by the nature of the question because I've never thought about my work as emotionally useful to me, which is like which is a hill I will die on, which is that my work is not therapeutic and it's not therapy and it does not help me in any way.
It doesn't be intended to do so.
Right.
But
I was going to say, and yet I'm driven to do it. I think more I feel shame, which is my other most frequent emotion, which is like, man, I wish I had known then what I know now. And that's sort of like it's like the challenge of the memoirist is like, I'm always evolving and I'm always growing, but I always think that wherever I am now is really maximum evolution, right? Like now I have a really clear picture of everything. So, if I were writing about this time in my life now, it would be nuanced and really appropriate, and I would have all the right boundaries and nobody would ever be upset. But but I wrote about it 2 years ago. But then 2 years ago, of course, I was like, well, I'm the most evolved I'll ever be. And so I think this is just the process of like, and people have written about this very well, right? We're constantly refashioning ourselves and remaking ourselves and having new perspectives. And I think similarly to how architects are like, well, there's where the wall goes, is as a memoirist, at a certain point, I have to say, well, that's how I felt about that thing at the time, and commit to it, and just kind of hope that, it'll help somebody else, if not me, to read it. So I read that section now, and I think, well, somebody said once that his best edits are holding the printed book at the reading is when he finally makes the good edits. So I sort of feel like that. Like, I think, well, now, but I know if I did that in 5 years, I'd be like, I can't believe Eva of 2022 thought this was what was true. But it helps me, I think, like when I have a gentler approach, I just think like, yeah, like I was saying, like 2019 was a very, very, very hard year.
But you got lucky. We had a global pandemic right after it took all the stakes.
Well, that's how Paul and I got together. We knew each other before, and then a pandemic happened, and we were like, let's date, and we can't see anyone else, so we'll just see each other and let's procreate, and here we are. So, yeah, it all. I did say to him recently, because we're both in our 40s. And I was just like, man, like, oh, I wish we could have met earlier. And he just looked at me and he's like, not feasible.
We hated each other once upon a time.
I needed my first marriage to be able to have a good relationship now. So, yeah.
So what did the book teach you?
It taught me patience. I mean, I'm such a impatient, immediate person. And this book was 10 years in the making. And it had to be rewritten many, many, many times. So it taught me patience. It taught me how to clarify an idea, because I kind of make 2 to 3 interventions in this book. And I would have thought that a book needed to make 1,000 interventions to be valuable. But it really taught me like this, how to articulate one argument and sustain it over time, over pages. It taught me how to follow a thread. It taught me to trust a hunch. I mean, so much of this was based on a hunch, right? So I was just like, man, I really feel like she was instrumental. And I kept finding evidence that was like almost right. And I remember like reading these letters and just thinking like, I'm gonna find the sentence. I'm gonna find the sentence. I'm gonna find it. And then I did, and I would. And like that moment of just like, okay, I can like trust my instincts here. And I say in the book, there's no smoking gun, right? There's no like arrows
aren't. We'll need to create a grapefruit metaphor here for the story.
Right, exactly. Or arrow being like, dear Elaine, without your narrative interventions, but I do think that I make a ultimately compelling argument. It taught me really like perseverance, so I went through this sort of like very rigorous peer review process, and I had 3 reviewers initially, and the first reviewer was like, groundbreaking, amazing, no changes, some suggestions up to the author's discretion. And reviewer number 2 was like, super, super good start, but I think it needs a lot of work in these specific areas. So, publish only with these things. And the third reviewer was like, said something like, this book is irredeemable. There's no world in which it will ever be useful to anybody. It's terrible, and Hagberg is a bad person with a bad personality. So I sort of, remember it. So I had to kind of pull myself back together and, write responses. And so, reader number 1, thank you so much for your gratifying response. And right, because there's all these sort of things you have to do with the university press. And reader number 2, I really thought, and reader number 2 actually encouraged me to put much more of my own experiences into it. Because originally that was just a preface. It was like, oh, by the way, I worked in this industry. So, so trust me when I tell you about publicity. And review number 2 was like, hey, I think this is really interesting. And But I had to really, address a lot of criticisms, and reviewer number 2 suggested cutting a chapter, which I thought was like, the heart of the whole thing. And the chapter is gone and nobody notices. And then, so I diligently rewrote it. And I remember I got a hotel room overlooking Ground Zero, I guess fall of 2020. And, sort of just like, okay, Eva, just like address all these comments, and sort of laboriously went through and did everything and then sent it back in, and turned out that reviewer number 2 was like not available to read the manuscript. So then, it wouldn't be for another 7 years or something. So then I thought, okay, hope is lost. I'll just, I went through so many phases of almost abandoning it and almost giving up and thinking like, well, I don't really want a tenure track job. So I don't know, can I just like leave this to the either? But my editor, Michelle Comey, was so dedicated to the project, and she's like, great, we'll find another round of reviewers. So we found them. Reviewer number 1, groundbreaking, amazing, no changes. Reviewer number 2 said, well, really, really super great start, but I suggest, taking out all the personal stuff, which was the opposite of what reviewer number 1 had said. And I just thought, I can't, this is eternity now, is just rewrite. And peer review is such a weird process because it is just people's opinions, but you have to sort of, I think it's important. It is important.
It's different when it's a science journal as opposed to a work of historical scholarship. Yeah,
because this is very well, is your idea good or your, and it is sort of framed like, is the premise good? Is the idea important? Is the execution convincing? All that. So my editor says to me, okay, here's what's going on. And I was just like, I can't, like, now do I rewrite it to, I just rewrite it back. I'd lost the old file. And thankfully, reviewer number 1 was convinced to reread it and then signed off. So I don't know what magic my editor pulled, but, I don't know who reviewer number 1 is, but I thank them in the acknowledgments because I think they really made this book better. And that's the other big thing that I learned is like, I'm such a sort of isolationist in so many ways. And this book was really... I got so much, I hate this word, but I got so much feedback. That was, initially my reaction was like, did you even read the book? It's like my brain is like, you didn't even read the book. And then I think about it and I absorb it and I'm like, wow, like really, really, really dedicated, smart people, like really took some time with my ideas over 10 years and made them better. So... yeah, I learned a lot of new practices and new moments of surrender. And yeah, just like...
You'd still want to do trade publishing in future though, right?
As
opposed to academic.
I want to do both. I want to do it all. That's why I did I don't know. I really like work. I think this is like... I think my vibe is like I barely work But I worked very hard on this book. And I enjoyed working hard. And I miss now having like a really big idea to think about all the time.
I was going to ask, is there another either historical figure or, centering on building or...
Somebody needs to write a biography of Douglas Haskell, who was the editor of Forum. But is it me? I don't know.
Favorite Saarinen building, by the way? What's your
TWA terminal? Just because but no, I'm between projects right now, which is like a very uncomfortable place to be, and I have nothing to think about besides like my own, neuroses.
And rapidly gestating.
I was crying with my therapist on the phone. I said, I'm not creating anything. I'm not being creative. There's nothing being created in my orbit. There's, no creativity is occurring. And she was like, Eva, you're creating human life. And I was like, I have nothing to do with that.
Yeah,
this baby is on its own. It doesn't count, So, yeah, I think like it's a good time for this book to come out because it can have a little bit of a life and that can be exciting. And I can, raise a worm. And by the time she's, a human, hopefully I'll have another book idea. My IVF doctor's like, if you ever want to write a book about IVF.
See?
He's like, I'm available for interviews. I'm like, you're the best.
Except until they realize how absolutely revealing you would be about the whole experience, at which point they take my name out of this.
I remembered somebody, I was thinking about, how are my clients going to feel? I hope they feel fine. I don't think I don't know.
The ones you name do not I didn't feel that you were
great
besmirching or discrediting them.
Yeah, and the ones I don't name.
There's a reason. Yeah. It's more contentious, and there's a reason why you don't name them, but it's also not calling them,
Exactly. I think, everybody's on a path, right? We're all doing our best. But I was thinking about how 10 years ago, somebody emailed me something and said, on background, Eva, because I know how you are. And I woke up this morning and I thought, what did that mean?
You knew exactly what it meant. You didn't want to know what it meant, but you knew what it meant.
I know. I gotta say, sometimes I'm like, I don't know, man, you chose, yeah. I still think, Gil, I still believe in my capacity to have a completely different personality if I just try hard enough. I'm 40 years old. It's pretty publicly codified. And I'm like, I think this year, we're talking to my psychiatrist. I said to him, I think this year I'm going to be less sort of sensitive and less intense. I thought this was a really reasonable plan for myself. And I thought he would say, good
Go
job.
Ahead, do that. Yeah.
And he said, well, you can't. You can't change your fundamental personality. And also, and this was very sweet, he said, and you shouldn't, because it makes you a really good artist and a really good writer. And so I sort of held on to that. I was like, right, people will read my stuff. I mean, the sort of prevailing reaction that I get to a lot of my stuff is initially this sounds interesting. And then they start reading and they're like, I did not sign up for this.
And why is she crying? I don't understand.
Right. Why am I crying? Why am I this is bad? I thought I was just reading about a building. And then there's resistance, and then there's discomfort, and then there's feeling really bad for me that I'm so bananas. And then there's this slow creeping realization that what I've articulated may not be as specific to only me as this person thought. And maybe this person relates just a little bit. And then there's this moment of reject the other, this is bad. And then when it goes well, there's oh, I actually feel tremendous relief that I'm not alone. So that's why I keep doing it, is I'm okay, I've gotten enough emails from people being I didn't know that was how I felt until I read you describe it. I get more of those emails than I get emails of people saying, Eva, because I know how you are. So until that ratio changes, And
I'll have you back for the next book, or so I hope.
Can't wait.
But, and unlike last time, we won't have a pandemic check-in like we had to do.
Oh, my God, I forgot. I got COVID.
How many times did you get COVID, by the way?
Only 2.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
I was afraid it was 14 or 15. That was another thing we missed in the what's gone on in the last 3.5 years.
No, but I do think that I get extra props for having OG unvaccinated March 2020 COVID.
We have audio of you gasping for breath, trying to, nonetheless, monologue, because that's your thing. But thanks so much for coming on again. I love the book.
For having me.
And that was Eva Hagberg. Her new book is When Arrow Met His Match. It's out now from Princeton University Press. And I hope we got across what a fascinating story Aileen and Arrow's marriage was, and what it meant for architecture, and how we talk about architecture, and beyond that, what celebrity really means, and the role of media and the audience in that discourse. Now, you should check out Eva's site, evahagberg.com, for more about her books, her essays, other podcast appearances, and generally what's going on in her life. And that's evahagberg.com. She's also on Twitter at Eva Hagberg, spelled the same way, and on Instagram at Eva May Hagberg, M-A-Y, all one word. Now, you can support the Virtual Memory Show by telling other people about it. Tell them about this guy who keeps putting out these podcasts every week with really neat conversations with fascinating people. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie, TV show, book, piece of music, piece of theater, building, whatever art exhibition you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me postcards. I love postcards. Letter, email, direct message if you're connected to me on Twitter or Instagram, or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. And that goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you get cut off, call back and leave another message. And let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something that would be interesting for our listeners to hear, but I would never include that sort of thing without the approval of the speaker. So let me know. Now, if you've got money or other resources to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, I always appreciate it, but really, my job treats me fine. This particular episode did cost some money because of all the tolls and the sheer mental exhaustion of driving to the Brooklyn Navy Yards on a Sunday in the rain and dealing with traffic and avoiding Hasidim crossing the street at weird angles and all that stuff. But anyway, I don't need your money. There are people who do need your money, both individuals and institutions. So go to GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato.go, Crowdfunder, or other crowdfunding platforms and find people in need for their health expenses, rent, artistic projects, and other stuff. And if you're looking for institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank, occasionally give to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions. But there are other things you can do. Freedom funds, other election funds, Planned Parenthood, women's choice and abortion. There are things you can do to help us work towards a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.